So this project comes out of an ARC discovery grant, which I'm pursuing with my colleagues Helen Sullivan, who's the director of Melbourne School of Government and an expert in participatory public policy, and my colleague Fiona Haynes, who here you'll see she's listed as criminology, but her work is very much around risk and regulation, and she looks in particular at issues of sociocultural risk. So how can we account for the types of risks that are perceived by communities, but which may be different to traditional actuarial risk, which is the kind that you'd normally kind of put on a matrices. So we're very much a complementary but interdisciplinary kind of group, myself coming very much from a social science background, looking at social impact assessment and community engagement. So in terms of the broader project, we have this lovely title. Deanna said earlier, she's like, oh, the Hunter S. Thompson references are just great. So I was really pleased that we were allowed to get this title past the ARC. So we've got our project, Fear in Licensing in Australia. We will be officially starting in July. So again, this work is very preliminary. The much broader project, in which this presentation is just a small part, is we're looking at a critical evaluation of the concept of a social license to operate as expressed in the coal seam gas sector. So if any of you have read my very recent work, some of the things that I've been looking at are, well, how do we define a social license to operate? What are the criteria which underpin it? How can we get beyond this language of, you know, we need to earn and maintain a social license, but what does that actually entail? So this project for me very much came out of those general interests, and we're hoping that the improved understanding will assist government, corporations, and communities to engage with and address concerns about CSG. So as a very, very early starting point, what I wanted to do was to look at social media and how it might influence this very large industry. So most of you in this room, I'm kind of preaching to the converted, and you probably don't need all these facts and stats, but one of the selling points of the coal seam gas industry is it has this potential to be a $166 billion export market, but we know that it's highly controversial. I was just talking to Will and some people earlier about another project I'm currently getting started with the Melbourne Energy Institute, where we're looking at the potential implications of coal seam gas relative to sedimentary basins. So actually a kind of whole of resource approach, and how the implications very much are currently untested. So working with geoscientists to have a better understanding of how the basins may be affected. And then also we're seeing at the regulatory level, very late last year, the draft harmonized regulatory framework for natural gas from coal seams, let's be very specific about the title there, was put through COAG and the Standing Committee for Energy and Resources. So if we just look at the current concentration of CSG activities, obviously Queensland is pretty big, but we've seen an increase treble since 2003. In 2011, we had 11% of total Australian LNG production from CSG in Queensland and New South Wales. And because I have so many CSG people in the room, I hope these figures are correct. But and there's an estimated 80% of remaining LNG in the form of CSG currently residing in Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria. So quite a big industry there. But again, I think these are figures you're all probably across. The other issue that's happening is we know that there's great expected growth in CSG wells across Australia. We can also look at related issues of water usage, and I think what's interesting here is the potential capacity of water usage for the CSG industry relative to other more traditional style land use. So if we look at Queensland households, you've got 308 gigalitres in total, whereas projected water use by CSG, we're looking at 1,500 gigalitres. And then those projections differ according to who is making the projections, which is also something I suppose we all come across. And these types of things. So the National Water Commission is projecting 300 gigalitres when we've got 1,500 from industry. So I mentioned before, I'm really more broadly interested in this notion of social license to operate. It is very much now a ubiquitous but also ambiguous term that's being widely deployed by the industry. We're also seeing it, though, being picked up more and more by community members as a means of attempting to leverage back against companies to say, well, we're going to withhold or revoke your social license. I was working on a project in the Hunter Valley a couple of years ago. We had a big community meeting with all of the stakeholders, and one of the community members stood up and said, well, you don't have a social license to be here. And it was a very powerful moment, and it was one of the first times that I saw a community member invoke social license in a way that companies have been using it for some time as something that's quite powerful and meaningful. So we want to look at, well, what are the actual criteria behind a social license? And also, when we talk about licensing, we often forget, that there needs to be a broker for the license. So who grants the license? Who can revoke the license? Who becomes involved in the licensing process more broadly? And then how is the license actually understood by communities? So one of the things that we found when we look at expressions of social license in either sustainability reports or industry documents is that the term tends to sit up the front, and even in the regulatory, the harmonized framework, it appears on page 2. And it says the whole reason for this harmonization, this regulatory framework, is because the CSG industry must have a social license to operate. But then at no point within the document are the criteria or the brokers for the social license articulated. So we want to know, how is it understood by communities? How is it being used? And this is that quote from, I think this is actually page 2 of the harmonized regulatory framework. So we can't reap the benefits from CSG development if the industry social license and community confidence have not been established. So we wanted to look in the first instance at social media as a potential policy platform. What we're seeing is that community groups like Lock the Gate, which being in Queensland you would all know, Lock the Gate, they are very actively promoting their protests and their activism and their work through both online, kind of traditional online resources, web pages, but also through a very wide range of social media. This is my buddy, Stephen Jeffers. Jeff is a public policy academic at Birmingham, and I'll circulate these slides so that you have the electronic version, because you can link to and watch his YouTube video where he describes a policy studies area called #politics. So he's looking at how Twitter in particular is now being used as a policy platform in the UK. And also, interestingly, for those of us who tend to be more qualitative researchers, how studying social media actually allows us to access big data in qualitative ways. So as a methodology kind of nerd, I'm really interested in that. So again, this is very preliminary, but what I want to do now is just take you through some early findings about the ways in which Twitter is being used as a policy platform and also a political activist platform around coal seam gas within Australia, and what types of things we can see coming out of the big data in terms of both defining a social license to operate, but also defining what issues are most important to communities. So we looked at Twitter accounts from within Australia. #CSG is very big, so for those of you who are on social media, you'll have seen that probably quite a lot. #coal seam gas, social license, spelled both ways, fracking, and a range of similar related hashtags and terms. There's this really cool software called NVivo, and if you're like a real nerd and you really want to do some qualitative research, NVivo 10 is awesome. Okay, so that's the thing. I know, I'm like so excited, it's really sad. So NVivo and Capture, what it actually allows you to do is to trawl through Twitter, and you can determine which hashtags or which handles, which are the usernames that you want to look at. And then in Capture, we'll kind of suck out all the tweets and put it in NVivo, and then you can evaluate it. So that to me is exciting. I probably have too much time on my hands. What we know, though, from studies like Jeff's around #politics and other studies of social media is that social media can be used as a very obvious source of social activism. It's very effective for establishing connections and networks, and particularly when we talk about the coal seam gas industry and the fact that there are a lot of rural and regional Australians who are impacted, social media is providing a very effective platform for networking and collaboration for people who may be otherwise distant to one another. It provides an opportunity for collaboration in a very speedy way, which we may not have seen before. And I think part of the reason that Lock the Gates activism has been so effective is because they do have this very speedy and very well-connected online network. And we also know that social media is an excellent source of information sharing. So one of the things that you'll see in the data coming out here is that a lot of what Twitter is being used for is not only kind of activist statements and getting particular stakeholder groups together, it's also being used to share information, but in a very, very targeted way. So the types of messages that come out are very particular to those stakeholders and to their perspectives and also their desired needs for information. In this project, we wanted to ask, though, can social media also be a source of accountability? So is it reaching the stage where community members or community activists can actually use social media to push against larger corporations to hold them to account? Can it be a source of brokerage? So if we look at the social license, can social media itself be a kind of platform for the brokerage of the license? And also, is it a source of legitimacy? So to what extent is social media actually accepted to be able to move it into this frame of legitimacy or credibility? We don't really have the answers to this yet, but certainly in early research I can give you some notions of what's happening. Okay, so I titled this, coal seam gas and the Twitterati. It's very helpful then to know what the Twitter sphere. Celine, you're going to be so excited about this, right? what the Twitter sphere. If you haven't been over to QUT and talked to these guys, you might want to do that. What the Twitter sphere in Australia looks like. So we have access to very big data. There's approximately 1 million users on Twitter within Australia, which is fairly significant given a relatively small population size. But who and how active are they? Well, what we can see from the work that's being done at QUT, and this is a Center for Excellence looking at creative industries and innovation. Twitter users tend to cluster around particular types of usage. So over here on the left-hand side, what you can see are NGOs and social policy, farming and agriculture, Greens, a little bit lower, and there's ALP and progressives. So the folks on the left tend to use Twitter purely for social political purposes. They're very much using Twitter for those kinds of information sharing and activism that we saw before. And then there's your kind of average Twitter users. So there's also opinion news, that information sharing component. And then we've got our Twitter users over here, and I love, these are such Australian kind of, right? We've got food, wine, and beer. Excellent. So you've also got your Twitter users who use it purely for leisure, and as it is rightly named, social media. But what we can see in the Australian Twitter sphere is that there are very, very clear clusters of politically active Twitter users. And certainly the groups that are noted there, especially farming and agriculture, NGOs, and social policy, are very, very closely linked to coal seam gas. So when we start to look at what tweets are coming out around a social license to operate for the coal seam gas industry for Australia, we see a lot of tweets like this one. So they may not necessarily be from Lock the Gate themselves, but they're from individuals involved with similar campaigns, and they're saying things like, to the industry, you'll never get a social license to poison our children, and then they're linking to pictures of gas wells or to news stories, which are negative news stories about the industry. Lock the Gate themselves, what they tend to do is both tweet about protests and activism and information sharing, but they then also use retweets to expand who is included in the conversation. So there's a lot of trying to say, look, we're just average Australians, but we're very concerned about this, and this tweet really exemplifies that type of conversation that we're seeing come out on Twitter. So I'm not radical, I'm not anti-mining, I'm a conservative and a 66-year-old grandmother of 11. Right? So there's a lot of attempt through Twitter to try and kind of normalize the people who are experiencing the implications of coal seam gas. And what we can also do, this is where like the in vivo stuff I think is really cool and I get very excited. What we can do is if we look at, for example, the most recent tweets by non-corporate actors related to CSG, this is the word cloud that we get. So one of the things that I'm finding really fascinating in terms of using social media as a means of considering what's happening in the community space around CSG is that we can actually capture now a snapshot in time of the particular issues and watch them as they arise. So I did this analysis a couple of weeks ago, and what you're seeing coming out, so these are the top 10 most frequently occurring terms within the non-industry produced tweets about CSG in Australia. So hashtag CSG is obviously at the center, but then, as many of you will know, there was the Pilliga Forest Santos issue where the aquifer was contaminated, and now that's gone, and Santos have been fined. But what we saw here coming out was #CSG water, so there was the aquifer issue right at the fore. Fracking, Santos right in the center, New South Wales gas. There was one handle of @Fear the Media, which was talking very much around we're not getting all the information that we need around this particular aquifer contamination. So they were very, very active. And then we had New South Wales politics and Australian politics, so two key broader hashtags where the Twitterati were really trying to bring in that broader kind of political spectrum to look at the CSG issues. The other thing that we can see is when we look at uses of the term social license with the CSG hashtag around this particular period of time, what we ended up with were a lot of tweets around Pilliga, and from non-industry tweeters, people say, okay, hashtag Pilliga, they have no social license to poison our children. They have no social license for toxic CSG. There's an attempt to buy a social license, and this one, you'll never get a social license. So those are the most frequently occurring precursors to the social license term, and then we can also on the word tree look at what were the most frequently occurring successors to social license amongst all of these tweets. And for the most part, what they were links to information. And the types of information that they linked to were stories like this one, which was a New South Wales government report on coal seam gas, and it's titled "Ignore the Page Count, Just Note, the number on the front." And it was very, very critical of this government report about the CSG industry. And then a range of links to stories very similar to this one. Santos rejects shareholder demands for halt to CSG project. So you can very much see how social license in this instance is being used by the community on Twitter in a way to say, well, we are going to withhold or withdraw or never grant you a social license. And then here's some information as to why. Then I was very interested to look at the other side of the debate. So all of those tweets I just showed you were from non-industry actors. But if we actually went to the official Santos, so @Santos Limited handle, what was coming out? What was really interesting was that from the community we had over 2,000 tweets about Pilliga. From Santos, who was the main proponent in the project and the issue, we had 13 tweets about Pilliga. And their focus was very much on information provision, so really pushing back against the social activism by saying, Pilliga, let's separate fact from fiction, and linking to this particular document that the company had put together. The other thing that the corporation tends to do is, and this is probably unsurprising but still of interest, they were unwilling to express their own emotion or kind of tone around how they were feeling about the issues. But what they would do was they would use retweets of others who agreed with them or their company position to then express emotion or tone. So this retweet was a classic retweet at APL Limited. APL Limited, some facts, not hysteria on Pilliga. So very strong language there that the corporation themselves probably wouldn't tweet, but that they can put in as a retweet and then link to an external source. There were also 3 direct responses within the 13 to the most influential activist tweeters. So where you had Lock the Gate tweeting quite a lot about Pilliga, eventually Santos did respond but it was a very kind of tempered response. The other thing that's quite interesting is if we look at the content of the Santos-derived tweets around Pilliga, we're seeing a very, very different type of discourse emerge than the one that says you can't buy a social license, you'll never have a social license. The precedents for Pilliga in frequency in terms of tweets were things around ways to ensure the environment at Pilliga is protected. We're laying a water pipeline, so notions of really positive movements, ways to protect the environment or rehabilitate. And then on the succeeding side behind Pilliga, we'd see Pilliga, let's separate fact from fiction. Things like communities will benefit from our work. The rehabilitation will continue. There's rehab and there's jobs that will continue. And then linkages to information, which were far more kind of positive reports. When we looked at the non-corporate actor Pilliga tweets, the thing that was coming out the most was this notion of poison or synonyms. So out of 709 tweets, which were specifically about Pilliga from the non-corporate actors, we saw poison or synonyms of poison appear 202 times. So the other thing that you see is you start to see a very strong repetitive discourse develop in the social media, which I think creates a kind of cohesion around potential social action around an issue. So here we were saying the Project Poison Aquifer was one of the most common tweets or synonym of that, and the linkages on the succeeding side in terms of the types of stories that were being shown were all ones around damage to the aquifer, both news and scientific reports. So going back to the kind of conceptual side of things, what we're really interested in here is how social media as a platform for political activism and also for potential policy development and creation, how it allows communities to express what my colleague Fiona Haynes defines as sociocultural risk. So Fiona says that these are risks that are often experienced as signs of danger, particular events or behaviors which are identified as a threat either to the social order or by a particular community at a particular time. And what we're seeing here in the social media in this particular time frame is that Pilliga is coming out very much as a perceived sociocultural risk, and we have a very, very different and far more tempered response by the corporation to that perceived risk from community. Roger Jones, who is at, I believe he's now at ANU, but he's talked about, very similarly to Fiona, the notion of calculated risk, perceived risk, which we would call sociocultural risk or political risk. And he has this really great example of the pink surfboard. So I grew up in the 80s in Splash, where Daryl Hannah was a mermaid, was like really popular. And yeah. I think it had Tom Hanks, like, you know, when he was cool, before the Da Vinci Code. So Daryl Hannah, there was some offshore oil exploration happening in California, and she went out with her pink surfboard and to protest, and so the pink surfboard became this kind of ultimate symbol of protest, and there's now a whole theory around the pink surfboard which basically says if your industry experiences a pink surfboard, you're in trouble, because it's like Daryl Hannah's a mermaid on a surfboard and you're just not going to beat it. Okay, so what we're saying here is that around social license to operate, in this kind of arena of public opinion which is occurring on social media, we're starting to see some kind of pink surfboards pop up in terms of coal seam gas in the industry. And the question then goes to, well, to what extent is this really emerging as a policy platform? So I said from the beginning, this is extremely early research. It's really a preliminary investigation, but it's certainly encouraging me to investigate further because I think there's a lot of richness and depth that can come out of this. I definitely think there is a pink surfboard there somewhere. But the preliminary results suggest some emerging questions, and that is Twitter an emergent policy platform? How useful, realistically, will it be? Does social media have a role to play in granting or withholding a social license? And does it perhaps put communities in a better space as broker of that social license? And then to what extent might social media affect accountability, brokerage of the license, or legitimacy of a social license? So those go to questions particularly about social media itself as a platform. To what extent is it taken seriously? To what extent is it seen as a bit frivolous or perhaps unreliable because anyone can go on and make statements? So I'll leave it there, and hopefully you have questions and all kinds of things. Good.